First of all, welcome everyone. I think this is the first community information session. I think there's another one tomorrow for PDHB teachers, but this is the inaugural one. So welcome everyone. My name's Job, and I'll just give a short description of how I actually fit into this picture. Because I have to be honest, for me, I consider myself an academic now. It's sometimes a bit daunting standing in front of practitioners, but I don't want to look like I'm sitting in the ivory tower and telling you how to do things. I want to listen to how you are doing it. So I'll give a little bit of an introduction into why I'm actually here. So as I mentioned, right now I've been an academic for 3 years, but 2 years here at UTS. We're incredibly fortunate that we're in this amazing infrastructure here. We're very close to all kinds of different teams and clubs. But I also realized that a lot of the work that we are doing is in senior players, not really affecting performance at the very highest level. There's very little in junior players. So when I came in 2 years ago, I think I was the only person working with youth athletes at the time. And because I was sort of daunted by my confrontation with you, I was thinking back, do I actually have any credentials in this area? Have I been a youth coach or a practitioner for long enough? And I started thinking back, and I saw that for the last 10 years, since I was 21, I've always been involved in some aspect of coaching. That has been under 6 players in football, soccer, which is my background, but I've been involved in rugby sevens, in the Belgian national teams, and field hockey, swimming, all as a coach. And recently I've been involved with the Sydney Swans for the past 2 years as a skill acquisition specialist. I understand this is no longer me, standing on the field, dealing with kids asking all kinds of questions, but it does show that I still have some feeling with what practice is today. And on top of that, I was educated as a physical education teacher and worked for 1 year. I was in a school, my class I was 20 at the time, and my students were 20-year-old girls. So I learned a lot from that time as a physical education teacher. But that sort of places me in that realm of, yes, I'm an academic, but part of me at heart is still a practitioner as well. So what are we going to do today? Well, we're going to focus on 2 main topics, and both of them, in my opinion or my experience, are reasonably difficult to talk about. Right? They're controversial. The reason is because anecdotally, I know that a lot of practitioners already know a lot about talent. They have certain conceptions about talent. And anecdotally, all practitioners do is design practice. Right? So these are the 2 things we're going to talk about. And my idea is really to provide you with information, not to tell you how to do your job. You're much better at that than me, but to provide you with information that hopefully makes you reflect on these things a little bit differently. So when we talk about talent, we're going to talk about one crucial question to start with. What is talent, and does it exist? We're going to look at some common statements about talent identification, and I'll use some of your knowledge in that regard as well, and we'll look specifically at practical applications. What's expected from us when we work with these talented or gifted youngsters? And then in the second part, we're going to look at practice design. And some of you might be aware that the way we looked at practice design as skill acquisition experts a while ago is entirely different as the way we're looking at practice design now. So we're going to look at something called a constraints-led approach to practice design. We're going to pitch that against some of the traditional methods, things that we grew up with when we were playing sport and our coaches were using. And then we'll specifically look at some practical examples. And then finally, we'll go downstairs into the sports hall, and we'll actually make you go through some of these activities as well as design your own activities. Remember, we are not here to make you do things our way, but we are here to try and learn from you how are you doing things, and to try and give you those vital bits of information that you can then use to apply or not apply as you want in your own practice. All right, so where do we start? And I think I chose this title really carefully. Since starting my PhD, which is by now 7 years ago, I started looking at talent. And my first conception was, everyone's always talking about these talented athletes. There must be something we can find that really describes who is talented and who is not. Who's going to be successful in the future and who won't be. And that's why I called this a quest for the Holy Grail, because after 7 years, I'm left with many, many more questions than I have answers. But hopefully, my questions will help to inform you on your practices and help you to be critical on some of the things that you might implement at the moment. So first of all, and there's going to be a model on this screen. Don't be afraid, there's lots of words, but we'll skip over it pretty quickly. But we have to understand what is talent. And when we talk about talent, what we really need to discriminate between is what's called giftedness and talent. Giftedness is when an individual belongs to the top 10% within certain natural abilities. And I'll give you an example later that'll make that a bit more clear.
Sorry, Phil.
Yeah.
Can we get the slides later? Can we get the slides later?
Yeah, I'll send everything to you, and there's a recording of it as well that you can get if you want. If you were to fall asleep during the presentation, I can just pick it up afterwards. Right, so there's giftedness in the first place. Who belongs to the top 10% within natural abilities? These natural abilities are things like, who's creative, who's athletic, who's intelligent. Right? And through a really structured developmental progress, we eventually develop those gifts into talents. And it's those talents that we sometimes talk about. They relate to which 10%, top 10% of our individuals has specific characteristics in a specific domain. Which 10% are really fast? Which 10% are really athletic? Not athletic, but which 10% are really strong, for example. And I'll give you, or the easiest way to understand that is to use the concept of intelligence. Let's say there is a child who is very smart. IQ belongs to the top 10% of their peers. We would say that that child is gifted. It is gifted because it has an intelligence that belongs to the top 10% of their peers. However, when we talk about gift, there is a long way still to go before that gift becomes a talent. And that's where a lot of you come into play, because to develop those gifts into talents takes a lot of work, which we will see later. Eventually, when that child ends up becoming top 10 within a particular domain, being science, that's what we call a talent. Now, to move that to a bit more of a sports-specific context, imagine there is a girl within your club and her hand-eye coordination is amazing. Her object control skills are amazing. They place her within the top 10% of all of her peers, right? That's when we talk about a gift. When she can develop those gifts into being a talented handball player, we are talking about talent. And those are really two big differences between talents and gifts that we have to think about. Okay? Because when we talk about talent identification, that means we are talking about figuring out who stands out compared to their peers within a group from the same domain. So we're not looking at which kid is good at soccer compared to all kids within their classroom. We're looking at which kid is good at soccer compared to all other kids who also play soccer, who also have maybe some gift within or gifted athletic abilities. And when we talk about talent development, I told you before, when we talk about talent development, what we're really talking about is how do we develop those innate gifts, those natural abilities, and hone them into talents. Right? So that's so far the theoretical background of what we're going to talk about. Because in practice, when we talk about talent, most often we talk about who has the most promise or most potential to achieve success in the future. That's right? When we talk about talents, we think about who's going to be the best soccer player when they're 25 years old. But in the literature, talent means something entirely different. There's a huge discrepancy between talent and actual achievement. And what I'm going to try and show you today is that discrepancy between talent and achievement is really well documented in the literature, but it's actually not seeping through to practice, right? Which is one of the reasons why we have these types of sessions. So, as I mentioned, the link between gifts, talents, and achievements is very unclear. And I'll try and use 3 examples to demonstrate that. The first one's called Terman's study of the gifted, or of the genius. And the reason why I use that study is because using IQ as a gift and domain-specific intelligence as a talent is really easy to understand. What this person did, Terman, is he investigated many individuals who had an IQ above 135. And that put them in the top 1% among all of their peers. They were the smartest kids that he could possibly find. And then this study is enormous. They followed these children up for 80 years. So over 80 years, they investigated what happened to those kids. What do you think happened to this top 1% of the best or the most intelligent children compared to their peers? Did they become presidents, lawyers? What do you think?
Some of them succeeded, some of them didn't.
Yeah, there was actually a really big proportion. Of course, some of them became famous writers, some of them became politicians, but there was a really large proportion that ended up in very mundane professions, right? And what that tells us is that the path from giftedness to talent to achievement is not as straightforward as we think. And in fact, what Terman or this study hypothesized is that whether you have an IQ of 135, 185, or 125, as long as it's above a certain threshold, as long as you have a certain amount of gifts, it doesn't really matter, right? And we see a lot of that within youth sport as well. We see kids who are reasonably gifted, who are reasonably talented, and still achieve tremendous success, right? And that's something that we have to understand. There's no clear relationship between giftedness, talent, and achievement. I'll give you another example. Is stature important for basketball? Do you have to be tall to play basketball?
Not necessarily, but it helps.
It helps, right? Because if you look at the NBA, you'd compare it to a general population, all of these athletes would have been gifted in stature. Even the smallest NBA player would have been relatively tall compared to all other people within their classroom, right? But when you look at it from an NBA perspective, stature no longer matters. As long as you reach a certain threshold, it doesn't matter whether you're 2 meters and 5 centimeters or 195. It helps a little bit maybe in specific positions, but it doesn't really relate to your achievements anymore. Okay? And then finally, I'll give you another example, a bit, sort of closer to my heart. Being a Belgian, we started back in 2006 collecting data on all of our youngsters who moved through our professional academies in soccer. Ended up with 10,000 observations of 3,000 individuals. How many predictors of success did we find? What do you think? Were we able to predict? All of these players were in our data sets, right? Were we able to predict any one of those? Not one, 0, right? The path from giftedness to talent to achievement is not as simple as we expect it to be, yeah? And obviously, and this is where I value the role of practitioners to an enormous extent, is you can influence that pathway, right? You are the most important aspect of that entire pathway, and I'll try to show you later on why I think that's the case. All right, so to get you into a bit of an exercise, I'll ask you to raise your hand if you think the following concept is true. All right, so if I make the statement, do you feel that it is true? Raise your hand. All right, talent exists.
Yeah, one point at a time.
Yeah, I'll go 1 point at a time. All right, talent exists. Future potential is predictable. Talent identification and development programs work, and I know some of you work in some of them, so you should be putting up your hands, right? Yeah, talent identification and development programs work. Talent is multifactorial. That means talent is influenced by many things. Yeah? Talent development is more important than talent identification. Of course, as practitioners, we should all be putting our hands up, right? So what we'll do is we'll go through some of the scientific evidence that underpins some of these aspects, and we'll try to mold that into something that you can use in a practical way. So we'll start with, does talent exist? What we've already hypothesized that talent does exist, but its conceptualization is definitely far more complex than we could have ever imagined. Who's aware of Erikson's deliberate practice theory? Yeah? And all of you who are not aware of it, who's aware of the 10,000 hour rule, or has heard of it before? Of course, it's the same thing, right? When we talk about talent, regardless, even right now, this paper was written in 83, and the other 93, and the other one I will show you was written in 82. Right now, a lot of our concepts that we still believe and understand about the development of expertise still stem from these almost ancient in today's, looking back, 20 years is a lot, right? 25 years is a lot. Looking back, even now, some of these theories are ancient, right? So what did Erikson say? Well, Erikson said, talent does not exist. There is no such thing, right? He said, there is a thing like expertise, and expertise develops without requiring any sort of giftedness. In other words, he says, if you pick up the violin right now, as long as you have 10,000 hours to practice it, you'll be an expert. I guarantee you. That's what he said, right? On the other hand, Sir Francis Galton identified that development doesn't matter. As long as you're born with the gift, read between the lines, exactly what former Soviet Russia did. As long as you're born with the gift, you'll develop the talent and you'll develop the achievements regardless. Yeah? Right now, and I do a lot of these conversations, I guarantee you that a lot of our knowledge that exists within practice still stems from either one of those theories. There's a lot of people who believe, oh, genetically this person is really gifted, he'll make it regardless. And other people believe, doesn't matter if they're gifted, as long as they put in a lot of practice, purposeful practice, they'll make it anyway, right? But, we've come a long way since then, and basically, I'm just demonstrating this with a publication that says that either one of those theories is basically nonsensical. There's no such thing as only one theory counts or only the other. Yep. What is really true is something that sits a lot more in the middle. Genetics definitely have some importance, but the developmental environment also is really important, right? So even though we know these things, and we've known these things for quite a while, a lot of the practices that we use within youth sport are still based on some of these age-old theories. So, when we go to talent in sport, even that last understanding of the fact that talent is genetic as well as developmental no longer counts. We know that talent is far, far more complex than that. In fact, talent or expertise of performance is an intricate, or is the result of an intricate relationship between the environment, the individual, and the task. For example, and you can substitute each one of those with a different one. And that's why talent is so complex. If you don't have the genetic, if there's no genetic diversity, if you have no previous experience, if you don't have the stature to achieve, which you get from genetics obviously, if you don't have the stature to achieve success in the NBA, you're never getting there. On the other hand, if you don't have family support, there's a lot of evidence indicating that if you don't have support from significant others, you can be as talented as you want, as gifted as you want, you will never make it. If you don't have a significant other in terms of a coach supporting you in the right way, there's no way you are developing those talents into achievements. Also, talent is different based on the type of sport. A very simple example is if you look at our gymnastics, female gymnastics, at 16 years of age, they are completely ready to compete at the Olympics. Right? I'm not saying they are psychologically ready, but they are ready to compete at the Olympics because of the nature of the sport, early peak performance. However, a 16-year-old triathlon or triathlete is definitely not ready to compete. Yeah, so talent also means something entirely different based on the sport we look at. And we're very lucky to have a perfect example of that just underneath, right? If you looked at all these rugby sevens girls who won the Olympic medal, and you would look at their background, some of them would have had maybe 500 hours of Rugby 7 specific practice in all of their career so far. Some of them would have had a lot more. Some of them would have been transferred from a different sport. Some of them are really, really energetic. Other them are more introverts, etc. So a lot of these, or the way that this team was put together, clearly demonstrates that talent is much more complex than we think. Because we didn't detect any gifts, we might not have even detected any talents here. But what we did do is we put together something in exactly the right way so it could achieve performance. So talent is much more complex than we give it credit for. All right, second statement. We said future potential is predictable. And I think most of you agreed here, and they said it's definitely not as easy as that. All right? So our question is basically, can our talent identification programs and the multitude of programs used all over the world in all kinds of different sports predict who is most likely to succeed in the future? Do you know who this is? David Beckham, right? Did anyone tell David Beckham when he was young that he was good? Yeah, as an under-15s player, David Beckham won Player of the Year in England. Right? As an under-15s player, everyone knew he was gifted, he was talented, and it ended up in an amazing career with many, many great achievements. However, we use that relationship between early abilities and later success in one individual, and we extrapolate that and say, well, if it's true for him, then it must be true for everyone else. But there were other under-15s players in England, many, many other under-15s players, and they never achieved the same success. Yeah? So the predictive value of these talent identification programs can't be as simple as they're made out to be. They're clearly much, much more complex. Yeah? And that's where our original model, when we talked about the complexity of talent, comes into play again. Clearly, talent only emerges under exactly the right individual task and environmental constraints. Right? And of course, I can feel you sort of sagging in your chair now and thinking, oh, I thought we had it for a little bit. Yeah? But there's actually quite a lot as practitioners that you can control in that environment. There's much, much more you can't control. There's quite a lot you can control. All right. So, of course, there were scientific studies that investigated the relationship between some sort of talent. Yeah, and as talent here, I'm taking the use of, let's say, physical assessments or coordination assessments at a young age to try and see whether that related to some sort of success in the future. And I'll show a few of those. The first one is in gymnastics. And in gymnastics, what they showed was if you measure someone's coordination in 1 year, you can relate that back. 44% of the variance in competition results 2 years later is explained by measuring that coordination in the first place. Right? We can argue, oh, that's not bad, you know, that's some sort of predictive value. But there are other studies. For example, this study that indicated that in the Belgian elite competition, using that data set that we collected before, we can explain about 17% of the variance in how many minutes, how many playing minutes someone gets based on performance data that we collected up to 8 years earlier. And you can say, oh, 17 minutes, oh, that's pretty good, right? In this study, these girls won or became second on the European Championships volleyball. I can't remember which year it was, but we went back retrospectively and looked at their motor coordination data. And we showed that elite volleyball players were much better or had much better motor coordination than non-elite volleyballers. So even though we can't predict potential in the long term, there's some sort of evidence that by putting together or by measuring the right things, that we can sort of predict 1, 2, maybe 3 years in the future, but not with a lot of accuracy. And definitely not the accuracy that's assigned to it sometimes in the popular media. Right? Because sometimes you see newspaper articles saying player X was identified when they were 6, offered a contract when they were 12, their parents were brought over, etc., because we're sure that they are going to achieve successful performances in the future. There is no such thing. right? In fact, and this is from a position, it was a position paper, but it's something we wrote for a book chapter on talent and giftedness in children. If we assume that 1 out of 1,000 youngsters attain senior success in sport, and that's based on the original model that we showed right in the beginning, 10%, 10%. So if we take 1 out of 1,000 youngsters attain senior success in sport, and the best talent identification method out there, and I looked through all the papers, classifies about 70% of the people into, yes, these people are going to achieve success, and these people are not. They're about 70% successful, and that is in all different sports measured together. If we take these kinds of numbers and we calculate the probability that someone that you positively identify, so not just anyone, but someone you positively identify and that you actually select becomes a talent, is 0.2%. So we have a 0.2% likelihood that the kid that we detect when they're young and say, we attribute tremendous talents to this young kid, 0.2% that they actually become an elite and successful athlete. Yeah? And that is obviously taken over all sports. For some sports that are a bit more unidimensional, that's a little bit easier. But taken over all sports, 0.2%, I don't think anyone's gonna gamble on that. Right? 0.2% is very, very low. But why is that? Why can't we predict if someone, and I don't know if you ever saw this YouTube clip, but there was a young kid kicking a ball into a wastebasket. Did you ever see that YouTube clip? Got offered a contract by one of the Dutch clubs, I can't remember, I thought it was Feyenoord. When they were very young, and I've been in these situations where goalkeepers get offered contracts when they're 12, or basically their parents get offered contracts for the next 4 years and get offered jobs, etc. But a whole club sometimes is banking on an individual who shows extreme abilities at a young age to sustain those extreme abilities for another 30 years of career. Right? It's completely ridiculous when you look at it from a scientific perspective, because these are all the things that you can't really take into account. These are all the things that influence whether or not talent develops in practice. And we're only going to look at a few of these aspects, of course, but we've spent quite a lot of time over the past 3 years investigating some of these. And what we're going to look at really shortly is the aspect of growth and maturation, relative age, and then chance or opportunity. So this is, I always take this picture, I know it doesn't look very good, but it's from our own research back in Ghent. These were 2 handball players. We measured, using an RX scan, we measured the skeletal age of each of these handball players. The left player's skeleton is 9 years old. The right player's skeleton is 13.5 years old. But they have the same chronological age. They have the same, they're both in the under 13s, let's say. But their difference in skeletal age is 4.5 years. Their difference in stature is more than 20 centimeters. Yeah? Let's say this kid is incredibly gifted. His coordination belongs to the top 10% compared to his peers. What is the likelihood of this kid ever making it to an elite handball player? Very, very small. Regardless of what we say about how much we care about, later maturing boys, in all of this evidence, still we can't find any evidence that these kids actually end up making it. More often than not, they don't, especially not in a sport like European handball, where stature is really, really important. What I need to tell you is the fact that this boy is smaller at 12 than this boy doesn't mean that he's going to be smaller when he's 18 years old or 20 years old. It might mean, of course it can mean that, but it might also mean that this boy has not entered his growth spurt whatsoever. And in a growth spurt, a kid might grow 10 centimeters a year. So in 2 years, let's say that this is an early maturing boy. Yeah? and he's in the middle of his growth spurt, then in 2 years, this boy can actually catch up with the other boy if he hasn't had his growth spurt yet. But the question is, if we know that that's so important, how do we actually account for that? How do we measure it? Right? The second thing that I talked about was the aspect of relative age. Most of you would understand this. I'll go over this pretty quickly. But this is a study that we did looking at career pathways in Australian football. Right? And we looked at all the way from entry, when they're coming to trial out for a high-level academy, to when they get Brownlow votes. We see a consistent relative age effect, and obviously we're not the only research institution that does. There are many, many more papers like this. But consistently, we see that if you're born early in the year, you don't just have an advantage when you're being selected, for example here, being selected, but that advantage carries through to something as really complex or high level as getting Brownlow medal votes. Right? So it's really, really crucial, the relative age effect. Regardless of how much we know about it, we still see it occurring over and over again. Right? And then finally, and this is one that I like and I always emphasize within these models, is the aspect of luck. Right? It's something we don't think about. But if Messi wasn't approached by Barcelona, who said, we'll pay for your growth hormone treatment that you require, there was no Messi in today's football, right? Or it was very unlikely that he would have been there. Pure luck. And we sometimes feel that youth sport, just like anything, or sport in general, is a meritocracy. That if you deserve to get there, you'll get there. But that's not the case. You have to be given the opportunity. And opportunity can be something as simple as living in close proximity to a place where you can actually play sport. Right? Especially here in Australia, you can live somewhere, but you have to drive an hour and a half just to get to the local field, let alone to get to a high-level academy. Right? And that aspect of opportunity, you cannot forget, is vitally important when you try to understand how good we are at predicting who our future most potential, or athletes with the most potential, are going to be. All right. Next one, I hypothesized that, or I stated talent identification and development programs work, and you said to me, we're not quite sure. All right. I would then argue talent identification and development programs do work, but they don't always work in the way that we suppose them to work. And I'll try and show a few pictures to try and point out how I think, or not how I think, how scientific evidence says they work, or how we as practitioners often think they work. So I'd like you to think of talent identification like a bucket. Right? You pour water into the bucket, but it has leaks. It leaks out, so you pour more water in, leaks out, pour more water in, etc. Yeah? And pouring in water is a result of talent identification, selection, good development. Water going out is a result of active deselection, dropout, and injury. That would mean that your talent identification and development program would look something like this. This is 100 young kids in a regular academy, right? I'm going to take a very liberal standpoint on this, and I'm going to say that our talent pool decreases by 20% with every year. Additionally, I'm going to say that there's a 50% turnover in how many talented individuals we have within our pool. Now, that is not something that I just invented here. There are a lot of talent identification and development systems with these kinds of turnovers. So, a healthy talent identification system would look like this. Half of your athletes no longer want to play, they've got girlfriends, they don't care anymore, they go out of the system. Some of them get actively deselected, some of them get injured, some of them drop out. Great, our pool becomes a little bit smaller, but we actually get an influx of 30 other really motivated, talented kids that might not have been mature enough or might not have been interested in the sport yet when we were at this stage, but now they are. And we continuously keep going until at the latest level of our talent development program, we get this really mixed group of youngsters who really wanted to be there from the beginning. Some of those that came in later, and some of those that came in at a very late stage. This is what a healthy talent identification and development program looks like. However, I'll try and demonstrate to you how most talent identification and development programs look, so how we use them. These are the same six kids that would eventually become these 6 kids. All right? Just keep that in the back of your mind. We decrease the talent pool. Don't allow for influx. Decrease the talent pool, but don't allow for influx. Decrease the talent pool, don't allow for influx. Decrease the talent pool and don't allow for influx. We're happy. We've got only 2 coaches at this level, so it's perfect. They can just deal with a lot less kids. After all, if we look at how these talent identification and development programs work, they are 5 times, or the entire talent pool, right, is 5 times smaller than what you would have ended up with if you allow that bucket analogy. Water flows in, water comes out. Water flows in, water comes out. I'm not telling you that as a practitioner, you should be actively deselecting kids, don't like you, too difficult, right? That's not the point. But there's a natural flow in these systems. And sometimes we're holding back that natural flow. And when we hold it back, this is eventually what we get, right? 6 really talented kids and a lot of fluff that keeps our coaches busy, right? And this is very often how it happens in talent identification programs. So what does the evidence say? Does talent identification and development work? Well, careers within talent development are generally very short. 70% of youngsters only persists for up to 2 years. And this is one I always like, and it's from research, extensive research by Arne Gulick. If you ever want to read something about talent ID, he says early in, early out. The sooner or the earlier your recruitment in one of these programs, the earlier you get deselected, drop out, lose interest, etc. Early success is related to reaching success more quickly at a junior level, but has no relationship to senior achievement. And there's very little research evidence that we can find that someone who was good at a young age, also good at a junior level, also translates that to elite. I'm talking about elite performance at a later age, right? And international level athletes compared to their national and recreational level counterparts entered those development programs often at a much later age, right? So our whole idea of talent identification and development programs work, I would still say yes. Otherwise, I mean, there's no point in me doing this research anymore. I still think they work, but the way we're using them is likely a little bit too much. And read between the lines here, deliberate practice theory, understanding genetics, rather than allowing for that fluctuation within our development programs. Right. Talent is multifactorial. As a proud Belgian, our captain, obviously have to talk about him, and I actually in the youth categories played against Company, and obviously I was less chubby than I am now, but still then I wasn't a good player, but Company was absolutely sensational. So he is, to me, even if I look at him now, he is an absolutely sensational player. Now when you think about Company's expertise, right, we know that he must be a good runner, right? He's fit. He knows the rules of the game. Cardiovascularly, he's probably pretty fit. He's very skillful. He's a team player. He's very strong and he's very smart. Yeah, so his talent, his expertise is not based on just the fact that he's, a good-looking guy, right? It's not based on just that. It's based on the fact that he has all of these attributes to some extent that make him a well-rounded and good player. And that leads us to something called a compensation phenomenon. This graph isn't that important. I just wanted to show you so I wouldn't forget. When we investigated, and this was for the trials for the FFA, we investigated the relationship between a player's maturation and how much they ran during games. What we found was that players who are later mature, right? They are not as mature as their peers. They are later mature. They run more in absolute distance, more in high speed distance. why do these athletes run more?
Try harder.
Yeah, they're trying harder. They're trying harder to stay out of contact most of all because they know they're trying to compensate this with more of this, right? And that's something that continuously happens. However, we are perfectly happy to say, you're not strong enough, out, doesn't matter, you're not part of this program anymore, right? Rather than saying, great, you're compensating some of these deficiencies or some of these weaknesses between brackets with being much better at something than everyone else. You're playing a different type of game, right? Somewhere else. I don't know if anyone knows who that is. Does anyone follow? I thought there would be females in here, but figure skating. I know there's an ice hockey coach in here, isn't there? I saw it somewhere. But anyway, this is Sarita Bonali. Never won an Olympic medal, but won many, many world championship medals in figure skating. And her signature move was she could do a backflip like that while ice skating. There was not a single other athlete in all of the world who could do the same move. Not a male, not any other female athlete. However, the reason why she did these spectacular tricks was because she lacked in finesse and in grace, which is the reason why she never got an Olympic medal in the first place. Her, or the judges in these competitions, said she's an amazing figure skater, doesn't make a single mistake, but she's not graceful. We're not giving her any points, right? But she is compensating that by being incredibly athletic and still fulfilling the same task goal. Just, what? I always do this. Yep. Just like these players are still playing the same game as their early and maturing counterparts. They're just running more to get the same outcome. She's more athletic to get the same outcome. And this is something that we have to understand about the multifactorial nature of talent, is that individuals who are within the system are extremely good at compensating for weaknesses with developing strengths in other areas. And that's why it's so important that when we measure talent or try to measure talent, is that we use a wide variety of competencies, abilities that we try to measure. Another statement that we've made not so long ago this year is something called the above average hypothesis. So imagine that these are two players, right? And these arrows here represent how good they are at a particular discipline. This is really bad, really good, right? And this is their average ability. These are two players with the same average ability. Which player are you investing in? Player one?
Player two.
Player two?
I don't know.
I don't know. I'm investing in this one because these are all abilities. They're natural abilities that emerge within a player. Being average at all of them is slightly over the threshold of what you need for playing a particular sport anyway. You don't need to be the fittest, the fastest of all players. It's great if you are, and probably this player who's extremely fit, as long as you don't give him many passes, right? Lukaku. I like Lukaku. As long as you don't give him many passes, yeah, it's still reasonably okay. He can still play in your team. But this would be the player that I want because he meets all the threshold requirements. He's above average everywhere. And this is another mistake we often make within talent identification. We want only the best. Someone who shows superior abilities on one particular aspect, that's the player we want. Right? They're fantastic at this one thing, but this one thing is not really contributing, because it's an ability. It's not really contributing to how talented they are. Right? You're better with an above average player in that case. And then finally, something we've been working on for 7 years now is when you measure talent, there's one thing that I feel strongly about that you should not forget, which is measuring motor competence. Now, what is motor competence? Motor competence is the ability to execute a wide variety of motor skills. And the way we test that is with something called the KTK. It's easy to replicate, easy to make. It has a participant moving boxes and balancing, jumping sideways and balancing backwards. Right? that single testing battery, measuring someone's gross motor coordination ability, has been related to, and this is in a recent systematic review, related to career progression in football, related to future performance in volleyball and gymnastics, related to competition levels in sailing, figure skating, school football programs, tennis, swimming, ice hockey, combat sports, and most importantly, it is unaffected by maturation. We haven't found it to be affected by maturation one single time. What does that tell us? It tells us that in fact, measuring someone's motor competence might be a window into their true ability, right? It might be a window into some of those underlying gifts that eventually relate to successful performance. I'm not saying that this is the tool we should all be using and let's all measure motor competence and nothing else, but if anything, if you're including anything in your multidimensional testing battery, think about including a measure of gross motor coordination, because clearly it's an important aspect of understanding how someone achieves some success or some level of success in the future. Right? And then finally, I said that we were going to talk about talent development is more important than talent identification, and the way I explain that often is using intercepts and slopes. It's a mathematical thing. You don't have to think about it that much, but basically when I talk about intercepts, I'm talking about where this line intercepts that line. When I'm talking about slopes, I'm talking about how steep that line is, right? So if we measure 4 athletes, the blue athlete is amazing, great performance. The red athlete is okay. Green athlete, we're not too sure. The yellow athlete, that's nothing for us. Right? We're measuring them at one particular time point and we're saying, we don't need any of those, we just need that blue one. But if you follow them through their developmental years, and developmental years, I'd say for a team sport can be entry into the sport when they're 9 years old, right? And their developmental years keep going until they're 21, 22. Right? It's a really long time. Over that time, the intercept or the differences in original ability are negated by how well they develop. And this is something that we have to understand as well. Talent identification is not about understanding who is best right now, but it's about understanding who has the ability to develop these gifts into talents with the steepest slope, right? And that's something that sometimes we forget in talent ID. We're perfectly happy to use one single testing occasion and then say, all right, I don't want this and this kid, I'm only going to take these 2. But we would have missed out on some great talent, right? So using momentaneous one-off measurements is probably not a good way to go for TID, because obviously that's where they end up. Fine. So now to bring us to why we are actually here, to wake you up, what can we do as practitioners? One thing we can do is to increase the size of our talent pool. And I know this is controversial, and we've talked about that many times. Increasing the size of a talent pool often requires large amounts of financial resource, etc. But I don't always mean recruit more people into our program. What I mean is be smarter in where you're looking for new talent. Look outside of the confines of your own academy. There's plenty of talent there. When we did the Flemish Sports Compass program back in Belgium, we actually saw that 20% of the most gifted children were not even engaged in any type of sport. They loved playing music, or they loved doing something else, or they loved playing chess, or their mum said that sports was too dangerous. Look outside of the confines of the academy to increase the size of a talent pool. Mitigate confounding factors, we'll talk about that in a second. Invest in development, not early or identification, but invest in the people you have who help develop these athletes. Yeah, they're the crucial key into understanding or allowing these athletes to develop. And then finally, develop adaptable problem solvers, and that's where the second part of our talk comes in. All right. So first of all, increase the size of the talent pool. One thing we can do, and again, I mean, you'll get bored of that, but I do it with my students all the time. I always use Belgium examples. Prevent active deselection, especially in vulnerable populations. You might know that Belgium 6-7 years ago had what's called a futures program, where athletes who were really small in stature or were identified as being relatively late maturing were actually placed in a team together, and they would play tournaments against future teams from the Czech Republic or Croatia, etc. So they would play against other players of their own stature. Now, I'm not saying that this is the perfect way to go, but it did allow for some of that talent to actually be retained within our high-level programs that otherwise we might have lost, right? Because having to compete day in, day out with people who are more mature, more psychologically mature, they're already, talking about entirely different things than you are, and they're out competing you in every single aspect of the game, also makes it pretty difficult. All right, then the second thing we can do is to keep the talent pool big is to reduce dropout, to make sure that we are not actively encouraging people to drop out, because dropout often is a result of some very silly things. For example, we know that someone who enters high-level programs at an early age, starts specializing early, they often drop out a lot faster. And this is a very silly thing to drop out for. Basically, read between the lines, they're bored, they're sick of doing the same thing day in, day out. Something you often see with, for example, swimmers, right? They drop out at a very early age because they just say, look, I can't take this anymore. Every morning, every evening, that swimming, it's too much for me. And then, this is a study we did in school sports. Another way to keep the talent pool large is, as I mentioned, is find non-traditional sources of talent by allowing for lateral transfer, something we don't do a lot of. In your recreational pathways, not the elite pathways, but the recreational pathways, a lot of really good talent is developing there as well. Sometimes these are kids that need more time, right? But allow for them to transfer laterally, because that's where you're getting a lot of that new healthy talent to feed your talent development system, right? So that's really important. Then mitigate confounding factors. How do we deal with maturation? Once we know it's important, what do we do with it? Well, one thing we can do, and it's very simple, is the moment they enter your academy, weigh and measure them every 3 months. At least then you can keep track of when are they growing the fastest. Is it that they are uncoordinated because they are growing really rapidly and their muscles are almost stretched over their bones, like walking in a new pair of shoes that's too small? Or is it because they just don't have the abilities to succeed? However, if you don't want to measure every 3 months, nowadays there's really good what's called non-invasive predictions that can help you understand whether someone is inside their growth spurt or outside of their growth spurt. And when I send you the slides, you can use this Google document. All you have to do is measure sitting height, standing height, and weight, put that into the equation, and it gives you an idea of when this individual is likely to reach their adolescent growth spurt. If you can't afford this equipment, you can just, not this one, we showed that one's not valid, but you can just use a simple box to sit on and measure. Yeah?
So does that mean when your kid's 2, measure them and double it, and that's what they're going to end up?
When they're 2?
Yeah.
No. So, sorry, I should have specified these prediction equations are only valid once someone nears their adolescent growth spurt. So if you're starting to measure at 2, the error from the measurement is so great, there's no point in trying to predict. But once they get closer to 11, 12, we've shown actually reasonably good validity of these measures if you can't use this sort of stuff. Yeah? So, and this is something simple that everyone can do, right? You can measure your athletes even with these estimation equations once a year. Keep track of when they're likely to reach their adolescent growth spurt. If they do, try to manage that in an appropriate manner. How do we deal with relative age? There are studies that have indicated, or one study that has indicated, that if you, during selection days, as you know, where talent scouts are looking at kids playing games, if you don't provide talent scouts with any information, they're consistently picking all the older kids. It happens everywhere, right? That's the relative age effect. If you provide those talent scouts with their birth dates, all of them are still picking all of the oldest kids. But this study demonstrated that if you used bibs, colored bibs, where the lowest number related to being born early in the year and the highest number to late in the year, talent scouts actually didn't have that bias. I'm not saying that I know how this mechanism works, but there are mechanisms that work in providing talent scouts and recruiters with information to not be caught out by that relative age effect. Or you can do something much simpler that we all do, is tell your recruiters, we only want 25% of our kids entering the academy to be born early in the year. We only want 25% of them to be born, or 50% to be born in the middle, and we want at least 25% to be born later in the year. Because in doing that, you're forcing your recruiters not to look at just the physically fit and strong kids, but you're forcing them to look at what do these kids have that sets them apart from everyone else with the same sort of relative age, everyone who's relatively young. All right. And then finally, invest in development, where I said what we really need to do is develop adaptable problem solvers, and hopefully in the practical session, that's something we can show you. Invest in coaching education, continuous development. I don't have to preach to the choir, you're all doing that because you're here. And then finally, develop support networks that recognize the roles played by significant others. So these two are something that we'll use to the next bit of this session.